And the evidence, I think, is conclusive, and more importantly has become conclusive to policymakers, that the traditional repertoire of policy instrument isn't enough, and that it's time to explore what other sorts of policy instruments might be out there that merit consideration as countries drive toward an increase in quality of educational outcomes. Next, please. My goal for this talk is pretty simple. I'd like to discuss how some of these initiatives in Latin America have furthered what I regard as important policy conversations about educational quality, and consider what might be some of the challenges and lessons that the Latin American experience might hold for other parts of the world. Basic premise that I will follow is the one that Jeff so aptly pointed out. I use a little bit different words. Premise of the talk is that any system that attempts to reform its policies toward a vision of quality requires a clear vision of what is to be accomplished, a system to monitor how these goals are being met, and a commitment to act in accordance with the results of the monitoring efforts. And we'll look a little bit about how these three areas play out in the context of Latin America. Vision and goals. Next, please. Most research, cross-national research in particular, indicates that accomplishing high levels of quality, for example, as quality is measured in international achievement tests, requires a very clear vision of pedagogical objectives that is also operationalized, and goals that are rigorous, challenging, has a well-defined set of priorities and foci, and that are evidence-based. Now, in order to abbreviate, I will sort of jump over some of the research in the case of Latin America, but let me sort of give you the conclusion. The conclusion of any sort of critical or empirical look of Latin American curriculum, goals, and other sorts of policies setting out a vision of quality for the system is that it is beset by a number of important problems. Ambiguity, dispersion, lack of priorities, lack of focus, and, to me, always most troubling, is an almost complete absence of any discussion of the importance of academic rigor in the curriculum. There have been a number of important initiatives in the region, new curricula, new statements on quality, and I've begun to believe that you can think of something in educational policy like the laws of thermodynamics, and the first law that I would like to propose is that consensus is always most likely the vaguer visions and goals are. And it's the vagueness of the visions in a great part of the region that gives the sense that we're all on the same page regarding quality. But as we try to define what quality means, some of our consensuses, we find out, were based mostly on these vague formulations and not on specifics. This is a quick result of a very long 48-nation study of curriculum in which I make a contrast between Mexico as a pretty representative country in the region against Japan, which is a pretty good representative country of a high-performing country in the area, and I'll just explain the colors very briefly. First of all, these are grades, and this is just a count of how many goals there are in the mathematics education curriculum from the very first grade of primary school to the exit grade of secondary school. And you'll see that everything that is marked in green represents contents that were in the national course of studies or in the standards at least one grade prior. Everything in red is everything that was in the curriculum at least one grade prior, but represents at least 8 to 10% of the content of the national textbook or the reported emphasis of teaching done by a nationally representative sample of teachers. The blue line represents everything that is new in the curriculum for that grade, and my wife tells me that color is fuchsia, I'm never quite sure, that purplish color is all new contents that are not only introduced newly that year, but that also represent 8 to 10% of lessons or the content of a national sample of textbooks. So you can see Mexico, as well as every other country that participated in this curriculum analysis from the region, including all of the Americas, the United States and Canada have a pattern very similar to Mexico, in which you have a much more flabby and redundant curriculum than is the case of Japan. This is an enormous difference. There seems to be in the world two philosophies about what the basics are in education. One philosophy, and I would say that the US is one of the prime proponents of that philosophy, is that if something is basic, it's basic all the time and should be repeated from primary through secondary school. So that we have children in the United States and in Mexico learning arithmetic still halfway through secondary. Other parts of the world, such as Japan, have the feeling that there's something that might be basic for second grade, but those basics must be mastered so that children are ready for a new set of basics the next year. This is what I would call a more dynamic vision of quality goals. And this is just one quick example. I want to move quickly to do a little bit more with evaluation. This is Latin America and the appearance of their evaluation systems. In 1990, there were none in the region. In 1989, there were two in Chile and Costa Rica, and today, with the exception of Venezuela, they are universal. So there has been an enormous growth in the area of monitoring and evaluation from ministries or extra-ministerial bodies over the course of the last 20 to 30 years. Next, please. Now, there have been some consequences to this rapid growth, and many countries in the region are struggling with problems that arose from the growth of these systems. First of all, as you can well imagine, there's many actors in the regions that believe that the introduction of evaluation was forced or imposed. And you can imagine the international bodies that they blame for forcing or imposing these systems. And in many cases, it's very difficult to present a convincing counter-argument, because in most cases, these systems were introduced without any of the groundwork, laying the groundwork for policy with the primary actors that most such innovations would be accompanied by. For example, very little consultation with teachers and teachers' union, very little consultation with principals and other administrative actors at the mid-level. Often, the ministries themselves, outside of the evaluation unit or the newly created evaluation, were unaware of what was happening. But then, in many cases, results were either completely hidden, as would be the case on occasion in Mexico and on the case sometimes in Peru, or were quickly disseminated, often accompanied in editorials by attacks at the teaching profession. So that you had teachers that, some of which weren't even aware that such things were taking place. The press published results from this test that they'd never heard of, had never been the public had not been prepared to receive, and then to boot, their work is being attacked. And of course, in none of these tests at any time is teaching measured. Teachers are blamed without there being any equivalent measure of the quality of teaching. It's just assumed. If the results are poor, it couldn't be because textbooks are arriving at schools half a year late. It couldn't be because the ministry hasn't paid for electricity for the past 2 years. It couldn't be because there's no sanitation. It must be because of the poverty of teaching. At least that's how many actors in the system have received it. And this has turned into an important challenge. And I think there's lessons there for the introduction of standards that I hope that the region learns from.